What are the best ways for you to use sermon illustrations in your sermons? How do illustrations make messages sticky and memorable? What types of illustrations can you use in your sermons? We're going to talk about that and more today on the podcast.
This is the definitive podcast for helping you plan, create, and execute dynamic worship experiences at your church. Useful, practical content in the areas of production, worship, communications, first impressions, and more. This is Making Sunday Happen.
Hey guys, welcome to Making Sunday Happen. We have some really great guests lined up in the coming weeks, including author of the new book, Praying Like Monks, Living Like Fools, Tyler Staton. Also, Dave Shrine will talk about preaching through the Bible, and my friend Daryl Giardier will be on to chat about how to evaluate your major Sundays and more, all coming up in the next several weeks on the podcast. On today's show, I welcome Justin Trapp. Justin is the founder of Ministry Pass and Sermonary. They help pastors with media, content, and sermon helps. I'm talking with Justin today about sermon illustrations. How can we use illustrations to explain Scripture? How do we deliver great sermon illustrations? How to use visual aids and props, and more. Great conversation with Justin is on the way. Hey guys, I want to tell you about my friends at Full Strength Network. They are a nonprofit organization that helps ministry leaders thrive in overall spiritual, emotional, mental, and physical health. It's an exclusive community for church pastors and ministry leaders, available through an affordable annual membership program. It provides essential services that are proven to help church leaders flourish under heavy pressures of ministry life and leadership. Your membership includes licensed counseling, biblical coaching, small group cohorts for ministry leaders, well-being content, and other strengthening resources. You can find out more today at fullstrength.org. That's fullstrength.org. Hey guys, today I welcome my friend Justin Trapp. Justin is a ministry-minded entrepreneur. He's the founder of Ministry Pass and Sermonary. Justin, welcome back, man. It's been a while.
Yeah, Carl, thanks for having me back. It has been a while.
So the picture behind you, and if you're listening to this podcast, you can't see this, but this is football. What stadium is that?
That's my beloved Texans. May they have hope this season. What little hope that we have. That's the NRG Stadium. And actually, you can't see it, but if I turn my camera to the other side, you'll see the Astros Minute Maid Park there. Yeah.
Nice. So. Astros fan. So I was a big baseball guy, early 90s. Bagwell was early, like Astros early 90s. What was a big, I can't think of.
Biggio.
Yeah.
Craig Biggio.
That's right.
I actually met him, Craig Biggio, when I was in high school. So in Texas, I don't know if you guys have them you're in North Carolina, right?
South Carolina, yeah.
South Carolina. In Texas, we have these giant, massive gas stations called Buc-ee's.
Yeah, they're coming over here. We just got them. Yep.
All right. So they're huge.
Yes.
So my dad told me the other day they're rebuilding the really large Buc-ee's that's between Houston and San Antonio, and he told me the square footage of a Walmart Supercenter, and it's going to be like 80% of the size of a Walmart Supercenter. This new Buc-ee's, which is wild, right? A gas station.
Yep.
So I saw Craig Biggio getting out of his big truck, walking into Buc-ee's, and I followed him, and I was able to catch up to him right as we walked into the bathroom. And of course, Buc-ee's bathrooms has like 30 urinals, right?
Yeah.
And I just wasn't thinking. And I said, "Hey, are you Craig Biggio?" And literally 30 dudes' heads turned around. He just looked at me like, "Are you kidding me?"
Seriously? Right now? Right at this moment?
Yeah, at this moment.
Yeah, so we just got Buc-ee's in South Carolina, and we went to one. I took me and my kids. My two sons are 10 and 12, and so we go in, and they had unbeknownst to us, they had just opened. So they were open like a week maybe, and it was so many people
Yeah.
that my kids were holding on to me like they're 2 years old. And I'm like, Dad, don't let me go. I mean, it was packed house just for some brisket, I guess.
It's a wild destination spot between the major cities in Texas. It's crazy.
It's awesome. All right. So give me an update on Ministry Pass and Sermonary and your podcast, right? Give me an update on what's going on with you.
Sure. So Ministry Pass, we've been around for about 8 years, and we are entering, I don't know when this podcast is publishing, but in October of every year, we release sermon calendars. So we release a topical sermon calendar, 52-week plan, so to speak, an expository where we walk through books of the Bible. We have a youth and a kids. And then recently, 2 years ago, we released a lectionary calendar. So we're releasing a new one this year. And then the last few years, we've been releasing a 1-year calendar walking through a book of the Bible. So last year was Acts. We're actually releasing 2 this year. We're releasing a 1-year sermon series through the book of Matthew and a 1-year sermon series through the book of Exodus. And Carl, we were doing I was trying to figure out how big has our library gotten? We've been creating sermon series for 8 years now, releasing up to 20 every single month. And I was doing the math on how much sermon content is that actually? And it's over 75 years worth of series content. So if you're a pastor and you signed up for Ministry Pass, you probably will pass away before you can preach through all of the content we have on the site. So it's kind of wild.
Nice. It's crazy, man. So tell me about your podcast, you and Wade.
Yeah.
Right. I was going to say Dave, but you guys started a new one with Dave Shrine, and I don't know the other guy's name.
Yeah. Dave's got us starting all kinds of podcasts lately, but yeah, the one you're mentioning is Hello Church. Wade and I, we're in our 3rd season, and usually every season is a theme. And so this season 3 is really the service, improving and best practices for your church service. And we sort of tackle one element of the service every single episode.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. So we're going to dive in today to sermon illustrations. So get us started here. Why are sermon illustrations important to help retain the congregation's attention during the message? What's so important about sermon illustrations?
Well, Spurgeon said sermon illustrations are like windows. They let the light in and illuminate your sermon. I've also heard it described that if a person sits, they attend your church and they hear your sermons every single week, whether we like to admit it or not as pastors, their view of God is like a window that you have crafted your sermons every single week. And those sermon illustrations are like beautiful sunsets as they look out through the window. It helps them understand the Bible. It helps them understand their relationship with the Lord in a more vivid way than just reading the scriptures on their own. And, we just talked about this a little bit earlier, but when a pastor has a moral failing, or you hear about a pastor, in the news, a famous pastor, it's like someone throwing a rock through that window. And because it's how they've impacted us and influenced how we view God so much, especially if they're newer to church. And then when something like that happens, it's like someone throws a rock through that and sort of distorts that view for a little bit. But yeah, sermon illustrations are really powerful. They help people understand. Jesus, I forget who said it, but Jesus spent a third of his words in the New Testament are spent telling stories, because Jesus knew stories are powerful. They help us connect the dots, so to speak, between principles and ideas. And it helps us just to, as human beings, connect with it, relate with it. And so I think, if you're a pastor, you've got to be using some great sermon illustrations every sermon, to be honest.
So I know you did a lot of research with this. So how long is the average sermon, did you find?
Oh, man. Yeah. So this is actually one of my most popular blog posts of all time. It's funny because I did the average sermon length of well-known pastors. And so I was going and I was just looking at their preaching time, and I was averaging like the 5 most recent. And well-known pastors preach a long time, to be honest with you. Rick Warren preaches like an hour, that was surprising to me. Judah Smith preaches like 47 minutes or 50 minutes. They all preach a long time. And of course, I know what a lot of bivocational pastors and pastors that are just starting out are thinking, man, like for me to preach an hour, like we're always trying to tell pastors they should preach shorter times. And then I put out this list and it's nothing but like over 45 minutes. So I think to answer your question though, Carl, every pastor needs to find their own voice. They need to figure out their rhythm, so to speak, as a communicator, but also do what suits you as a communicator. Some pastors love to just dig in and every sermon is this dense endeavor. And some pastors want to be very practical. And if you're being really practical, I don't know that an hour-long sermon is going to be as impactful, so to speak, as a more dense endeavor. So I think whatever suits you, I would say, go after that, not what Judah Smith does or Rick Warren does or whatever.
So as it relates to that, what is the optimum attention span for adults? If I'm going to preach a 45-minute sermon, do I only have people for 20 minutes?
That's a great question. I haven't done research on the average adult, attention.
I don't know why you don't know this off the top of your head, man. I mean,
I know what Microsoft says, right? I know what
kidding.
Microsoft says. They did the study with the goldfish, right? It's like humans and goldfish have like similar attention spans, and it's like 7 seconds or something crazy like that. If you just Google Microsoft goldfish attention span, you can find it's a pretty wild study, and they basically said humans, adults, we're just bouncing from thought to thought all the time, and it's really hard to like captivate us. But I think if you're a pastor, especially if you're new, I would shoot for 35 minutes, no more. And if you get any less though, it gets really hard to sort of achieve what you want to achieve. What is the Mark Twain? He said, if you want to get me to give an impromptu speech on something, and you want it to be 2 paragraphs, I need 2 weeks to prepare. So something like that. But,
right. So does this mean if attention spans are shorter, does it mean that I need to cut my message down, or should I continue to go 35 minutes? How does my attention span relate to the length of message?
So there is a great book by Patrick Lencioni called Death by Meeting. Have you read it, by the way?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Death by Meeting. So he talks about how come we dread going to a 15-minute team meeting, but we'll sit in a movie for 2 hours. Why is that? And he talks about the different types of meetings that we need to have for our teams. And I think the same is true, Carl, for sermons. I think, pastors, you can have a 45-minute message, right? Stephen Furtick or Judah Smith or whoever can have one of these longer messages, but it's because they've spent so much time making this sermon as impactful as it can be. It's filled with illustrations, with quotes, with dynamics. They've rehearsed it. They have a team behind them helping them with their research. Like a lot goes into this. And so they can get away with a longer message. So I think maybe the answer isn't for us to all just preach shorter messages, but for us to all work harder at the messages that we do preach.
So getting back to illustrations. So with that in mind, how often should I put in an illustration in my sermon?
I mean, I think every sermon deserves multiple illustrations, right? If you have multiple points, I would do an illustration for every point, to be honest, if you have it. I think it's important for us to remember, like using a mediocre illustration just for the sake of using it in a point is not going to do, any justice for the people listening to the sermon. But I do think it's important that you do utilize them. I mean, Jesus utilized illustrations. There is the parable of the mustard seed, right? Where Jesus is talking about the mustard seed, and he's telling the disciples, you can move mountains. And it always seemed, I didn't really understand it until I started doing more research. And in those days, Herod was he was literally moving this mountain. It's called Herodium. And he wanted to build this palace at the highest point around Jerusalem. He wanted his palace to be sort of overlooking everyone. And so he had this forced labor, and they were literally moving a mountain, building this fake mountain. And I just imagine Jesus telling the disciples that, with this background of this mountain being physically moved in that area, and the disciples were all well aware of that. So once you understand that parable, you sort of see, okay, Jesus was using sort of cultural events, everyday events, to illustrate something to the disciples. And I think it's important as pastors that you can use, things that are happening in the news. You can use your personal, every pastor has used, a parenting story, right? At least once a message.
Right.
But
I think my dad's a pastor, so it was, I was the sermon illustration multiple times.
You were, yes, that rings true, right? For most everybody listening. So I think it's important that you use illustrations from your own life that you can share with authenticity. I would say we've seen this in the past, right? The whole plagiarism scandal with the SBC. Don't use someone else's sermon illustration like it's your own. And I will admit, I've made the mistake of doing that in my early years in preaching, when I was just new to preaching and I didn't know how to preach. And so I'm just trying to grasp at whatever connective tissue I could find. And so I quickly pivoted from like, hey, it's my own illustration, to saying something like, hey, I heard recently, a friend of mine or Andy Stanley said this, and I thought it was funny, or it was interesting, or it was compelling. And so I'd sort of caveat it with that. Right. And I think then you can share the illustration, but we shouldn't use other people's illustrations as our own, for sure.
What are some things that sermon illustrations do to the brain when listening? How does it kind of jumpstart our concentration? Well,
I think the nature of an illustration is it can be interesting, right? Especially if it has tension, if it has meaning. It's not just someone teaching principles or reading from the scriptures. It's actually saying, hey, here's an example of how this looks in the flesh, in the real world. Here's how you can wrap your mind around this concept, right? And I think illustrations helps retain attention. In a world full of noise, if you're a pastor, you start telling a story right in the middle of sermon, suddenly everyone's sitting up, everyone's paying attention. Maybe they're laughing. Maybe they're interested. I think a great illustration has tension, right? You don't resolve it until the end, just like a great sermon. You're not trying to resolve everything at the beginning. You're trying to get people to lean in. And this goes back to a death by meeting, where he talks about in movies, right? There's usually something at the beginning of the movie that creates this unresolved tension where the person needs something. They have sort of a philosophical desire, or they're poor, or there's something that they need, and the movie sort of identifies this, whether out loud or subconsciously, and then the entire movie works to resolve that issue, right? I think a great sermon and even a great illustration follows this same pattern, and the reason why I think it's important for us to do that is it keeps people engaged, right? It makes it memorable, it makes it sticky. It long after they leave, and Carl, you know this, you've heard probably thousands of sermons. You may sit in a sermon and forget everything about the sermon, but years down the road, you'll still remember that story that the pastor shared about something in his life that was funny, or it was unique, or it was abstract. I feel like a lot of the sermons that I remember, oftentimes they're illustrations. They're not necessarily a lot of the sermon itself. So
how can they help illustrate scripture? And we've spoken to that a little bit, how Jesus used that. But how can we use illustrations to bring scripture to life?
Well, I think it goes back to what we've been saying. If you're sharing a particular principle, or you're sharing a particular passage, when you connect that to an illustration, it helps people understand that concept in a real world scenario or in a story that they understand. It engages the audience, whether it's physically or with their imagination. There's this, when I was in kids' church, the children's pastor had sort of like been prepping up. Here's a great example. They've been prepping up with this, like, hey, we're having the most dangerous weapon on the planet. and it is a powerful weapon. And I was scared to bring it into kids' church because it's so powerful. I don't want anybody to, be scared. And so they had this tray, and it was like a sheet covered over the tray. And he hired, or people in the church that were police officers, he had police officer escort, right? And they brought it in, and it was like this really big thing. And everyone is just like, as kids, we're just like on the edge of our seat, right? And he unveils the most dangerous weapon in this world, and it's a cow's tongue. And he went to talk about the tongue, the words that we use. It was the most powerful thing in the world. And so I never forgot that illustration, right? I never forgot that principle. And I think that's a really sort of dramatic portrayal of a sermon illustration. So a sermon illustration can be a personal story, or you can get as dramatic as that. I think both are warranted and both are needed when trying to communicate the gospel. Because, Carl, you know this. If you're a pastor, or you're a deacon, or you're a youth leader, and you're up in front of a stage, and there's this diverse room of people, right? You have the unchurched single mother, and you have the been to church all their life, a retired couple, and you have that's a wide spectrum, and then you have everybody else between that spectrum sitting in the audience. You have to communicate the gospel in a way that sort of connects and resonates and sticks with everybody inside that spectrum. And I think it's really challenging, to be honest with you. I don't think pastors give themselves enough credit on how hard it is to preach a sermon that sticks, how hard it is to preach a sermon that connects, that inspires people, that motivates people, that they can take and apply the message of the gospel into their lives that week. I think it's really hard to do. I think pastors don't give themselves enough credit for how hard it is. And I do think sermon illustrations really make that job a little bit easier to connect with the unchurched single mother and the retired couple and everybody else in between. I think sermon illustrations, because we're all people, we're all human, right? Whether we have regardless of our social and economic status or our religious upbringing, whatever the case may be, stories connect people together. I think that's why they're so important in our sermons.
How important is it for the illustration to relate to my big idea, the main points of my message?
Well, it should, right? It should complement it. It should not compete with your big idea, or should not compete with a sub point within your message. It should complement it. It should enhance it. It should paint the picture, so to speak.
Yeah.
I would advise against just using an illustration. It can be hard too when you're trying to find a good illustration, and it's like, man, nothing is working here. And I've sat in that chair where I'm like, man, I need an illustration to finish this last point. And I'm going to sermonillustrations.com or whatever the random site. And I just seems like nothing is really fitting. Don't just share a random illustration that you know is going to fall flat, or it's just not going to work just for the sake of having it. I think it's important that you find something that really, really complements what you're trying to say. And it's not just a random funny story, right?
Yeah, good. What about the delivery? How important is the delivery of my illustration?
Well, who was it? Don't stone me, everyone, but Rob Bell said, Rob Bell said, it always stuck with me. He said, you can ruin a good sermon by talking sometimes. And that always stuck with me, because he was talking about rhythms in the voice and delivering a message and pausing and letting someone to just sit there. If you notice, right after I said that quote from Rob, I just let it sit, right? Because his point is when you're communicating the gospel, when you're sharing a story, it's important that you have dynamics. It's important that you let a moment sit with people. If you're just rushing through it, there is no moment created. And I remember an illustration one time when I was on staff. It was my first ministry job. It was at Westover Hills. Pastor Jim Ryan, great communicator. And his sermon was about the war on our minds, right? Our thoughts, and overcoming those negative thoughts that we have. And he was talking about how the enemy will plant thoughts in your mind. And he had the audio engineering team put some effect on his voice. And so he backed up and he was like, here is what the enemy thinks about you, right? So he backs up. It was almost like he changed characters. It was a big, long pause. And then he started talking again. And he had this really dark, demonic effect on his voice. And he started talking to the audience and he was like, I hate you. I want to destroy you. I want you to fail in your marriage. I want you to be a terrible parent. I want you to be so overwhelmed with all of the busyness of the world that you lose. Like he just began to say these things for like 60 seconds and then he backed up, he paused, and then they took the effect off. And I never forgot that, right? It was so powerful for everybody in the room because it wasn't just saying, hey, the enemy wants to say, I hate you. It wasn't just like, he literally used some audio effects to really drive home that point. And I don't even remember what your original question was, Carl, but I just, when you asked me that, it made me think of that illustration.
The delivery.
Yeah. The delivery.
Yeah. That he changed the delivery of how he did that in order to make a point. So what about visual aids, props? Tell me the best ways to use those.
Well, I mean, people learn different ways. So I think you need amazing graphics. You need amazing pictures. You need something visual to go with your sermon, to go with your illustrations. Not every illustration needs a cart with police officers escorting it down the aisle.
Right.
But I do think it's important for you to mix it up. Who was it that Ed Young said that the higher the predictability, the lower the connectivity. And so I think if your sermon illustrations are always the same and you always tell them the same way, and it's always a story about you goofing off with your kids, I think that lowers the connectivity over time. So you just want to be different. You want to be diverse with how you deliver your illustrations, how you prepare your illustrations, whether you have props. Our pastor, Marty, growing up, he used to do, like, he put on this scientist lab and he'd do this little science bit about, you've probably seen it in children's church too, with the water, and then it clouds the water and then the water's clean again. He would do props from time to time, and it was fun, right? It was fine. And then other times he wouldn't. I remember one time he had a big fishing net, and he talked about how when Jesus called the disciples, he said, leave your nets and come follow me. He said that, they weren't dragging their nets through the city following Jesus. They had to sort of sacrifice and abandon what they viewed as their old life. And so he just was walking around the entire sermon with this giant fishing net on his back. And it was a great visual, right? It didn't require much work. You just need to find a fishing net. So I think having diversity in your illustrations and not being predictable in your delivery and what you do. I mean, you don't want every illustration you have, Carl, to be a science experiment, so to speak.
Right.
But I do think it's fine, from time to time.
What are some types of sermon illustrations?
Well, so you have stories from your life. I think that's the easiest one, right? You have personal testimonies, which is, again, stories from your life. You have historical examples, maybe George Washington cutting down the cherry tree. You have those types of things. You have biblical analogies. You have parables. You have statistics. You have articles. Someone wrote an article. Maybe it's something happened in the news, a cultural event, a pop cultural event, maybe a movie's coming out that is everyone's talking about, that maybe you could see how this movie is addressing this issue, or it involves this issue, and let's see what the Bible says about this issue. You have devotional commentaries, jokes. I mean, you could use a joke, and then poems. I mentioned Jim Ryan. Jim Ryan would always use a poem towards the end of his sermon. I say not always, but oftentimes he would use a poem at the end of a sermon. He loved poems, and so usually he would find a poem that would fit that landing point there. So I think those are some of the types of illustrations that pastors can have at their disposal.
All right, last question for you, then I'm going to hit you with some rapid fire.
Yeah.
All right, what are some lasting benefits of sermon illustrations? Obviously, you've remembered some over the years, and they've stuck with you. What are the lasting benefits of using sermon illustrations?
I think two come to mind, and I've shared them both already, but it makes the sermon memorable. You remember the point, you remember the sermon, it sticks with you. I mean, some of these messages, Carl, they preached 20 years ago, and I still remember them, right? And I think two goes back to that original quote from Spurgeon, right? That sermon illustrations are like windows. They let the light in. They illuminate the sermon. They illuminate the gospel. They illuminate something in that passage that had remained dark previously. Maybe the person sitting in the sermon has read that passage 5 times in their life, or 5 times this year, and all of a sudden you share this illustration, and all of a sudden it just illuminates it with a new angle, a new perspective, and that really helps people grow in their faith, and their faith is strengthened when they hear a sermon illustration or when you share a story. I think those are the benefits. It makes it memorable, but also deepens people's faith in the gospel. And, that's always a wonderful thing as a pastor, trying to communicate and get people to apply what you're teaching.
Good. All right. Some rapid fire for you. Here we go. You ready?
Yeah.
Number 1, do you have any regrets in ministry? Things you wish you would have done differently?
Do I have any regrets in ministry? Things I wish I would have done. Man, I would have done a lot of things differently, Carl. As it relates to preaching, I wish I would have been able to find my own voice faster. You're in this ministry pipeline, you go to seminary, and I was in seminary for a year, and then for some reason, they gave me a job at a large mega church to be a junior high youth pastor. I'm like 20 years old, barely, by 5 minutes. And I'm having to preach every week. And I'm also having to, at that church, they had a really strong counseling culture. And so I'm a 20-year-old trying to counsel parents on how to deal with their teenager. I was ill-equipped, right, at public speaking, but also counseling for sure. And I wish I would have been able to develop that a little bit more, and maybe stay in school longer, or maybe get better training, a better mentor. My pastor was meeting me all the time, but there's only so much, right, that you can really be prepared for at 20 years old. So I'd say that.
All right. Off the wall here. What is your favorite word?
Anti-establishmentarianism.
Of course. Like everybody. Yeah. All right. Number 3, what is one thing that encourages you about the church today?
I'm encouraged when I see life change. I'm encouraged in my own church, the progress I've seen people make, struggling, going through hard times, whether it be, in Houston, we had Hurricane Harvey, and to see some of the ways that our church pulled together, and the people, not just our church, the people in our church came together to help those in need. I mean, that inspires me, that encourages me, that lifts up my spirit to see what God is doing, and the people that our church reached out to, they still go to our church, stuff like that. Anytime you see the gospel in action, you see the good news happening, you see people's lives being changed, I'm encouraged.
Yeah. What is one mistake that pastors make consistently?
Oh, man. I think, I'm with Brady Shear on this. I think churches in general trying to stream their services all the time is sort of a square peg in a round hole strategy. You've got all these platforms, TikTok and Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. It's all like people are consuming content all day long, but it's short form content. It's micro bite-sized content. And here we are, churches, we're publishing what I call long form content, right? Long form content is like a movie, a concert, a sermon, a worship service, right? We're sort of publishing that and pushing it onto, no one's consuming a full movie, Carl, on Facebook, right? They're watching a 30-second video. And for some reason, churches are we've been real stubborn and like, let's just stream the sermon. Let's publish our worship service. And I get like some people are need can't be, they can't attend, but I do think maybe we just need to switch up our strategy a little bit. It's not I'm not saying pastors shouldn't stream a sermon. I'm saying that that's not the apex goal from a digital strategy standpoint.
All right, last one. What character trait do you most admire in other people or pastors?
Kindness. The world is not kind. And anytime you have someone who's kind, they have no enemies, that to me stands out. Be kind to people.
Good. Well, man, I appreciate what you do in ministry. I have a lot of respect for you and your team. And man, really appreciate the time today. Thanks so much for sharing this.
Thanks, Carl.
Hey guys, Grant Murphy here from the 1230 team. This week, we want to give you an amazing coupon code for you to try our Series in a Boxes from our ready-made media library for 50% off. I want you to go to seriesinabox.com. You can choose any box from our growing library. At checkout, use the code MSHBOX50, MSH as in Making Sunday Happen, MSHBOX50 at seriesinabox.com. That code will take any box down from $59 to $24.50. 50% off any box using code MSHBOX50 at checkout at seriesinabox.com.
The show notes for this episode are available now at makingsundayhappen.com.
Hey guys, thanks so much for joining us this week. Next week on the show, I welcome Tyler Staton. Tyler is the author of the new book, Praying Like Monks, Living Like Fools. It's a great book on prayer and how we should pray as ministry leaders, how to incorporate prayer into our worship experiences, and more. Don't miss next week. Really interesting and spiritually powerful conversation with Tyler on our next episode. We'll go out there and create some incredible worship experiences at your church this weekend. I'll catch you next week.
Making Sunday Happen is a production of the Ministry of 1230 Media. For show notes, archive episodes, and more free resources for your church, visit makingsundayhappen.com.